There is a tradition that spiritual truths of a certain order should only be taught to people who have reached a certain level of refinement. And there's a good reason for this, because if we are still bound by self-interest, too often the ideals of spiritual teaching can be used for self-interest rather than for liberation. Many years ago, when in the late 60s, when I was just becoming acquainted with the elements of this path, there was a man in my circle of acquaintance, he wasn't really a friend, who had taken all these teachings. We were all learning them together. There was a little crowd of us, actually right here in Palo Alto, a little crowd of us sort of discovering all of this as people were at that time. And he took this idea that everything is the same and that we're all the same as one another and that it's all manifestations of the same light as if a justification to become a thief. Because what's yours is mine, and since I'm you, and he really had it all worked out where it was all just fine for him to do that. It was comical to everyone but him. To him it made sense. He just had taken the teaching in that way. Well, I was reading, reflecting on the implications of the reading today and how different it is to be standing from a point of view where you perceive the reality than it is to be standing from a point of view when it really sounds interesting to you and you hope that it's true. When Master was healed from the usual fatal disease, it's actually very touching because his reverence he showed to his mother. It was Lahiri Mahashaya's light that had cured him, but he turned toward his mother. As soon as I was able, I've read that story many times, as soon as I was able, he didn't say, I raised my hands in pranam to Lahiri, but I touched the feet of my mother in reverence for her great faith, because it was her great faith, apparently, as he tells the story, that gave him the power to surrender himself as completely as he needed to. It's an interesting aspect of that. When we were in, it might have been Siena, Italy. It was I'm pretty sure that's the city, but it doesn't matter. The tour guide was telling us this story about an event in the history of the city where the holy wafers, the consecrated wafers, which are considered to be the incarnation of Jesus, some terrible person had come and stolen the consecrated wafers. And at the time, this was like Jesus himself had been kidnapped, and the whole town became utterly distraught over this. And they all prayed, and as the priest told the story, because everyone was praying, in some miraculous way, the holy hosts were returned. Swami's comment was very interesting. He just turned and he said, there must have been a saint among them who was praying. And he said, no matter how many prayers there are, the sheer number does not create power, because everybody just vibrates on the level that they vibrate, and even if you have lots of them, they're all still just vibrating on that level. They're vibrating on the level of their own actual capacity to be in tune, to adjust their own consciousness to the reality of what they're seeking. Does that make sense? So what Master is describing is that his mother was so deeply, had such a deep realization, not merely an idea, but such a deep realization of the unlimited power of her guru and his responsiveness to her relationship with him. Spare my son. That the power came through. All Master had to do was not resist, seemingly, but the real power had come through her. She was the saint who was praying. Now, I read recently something that Swamiji said. He quoted that very well-known phrase that people are always using, God helps those who help themselves. And usually that's meant to be, well, we have faith, but of course we have to do our part. And it reminds me of when Swamiji was in a radio interview and someone was talking to him about the founding of Ananda, and they said something, well, what have you done in a practical way to make Ananda succeed? And he said, faith in God is the most practical thing there is. And he wasn't just affirming that, he knew that. Because, and then Swami went on to say, in what I was reading, to help yourself means to put your own consciousness in tune with a higher vibration. Because the power of the divine is always manifesting exactly the same. It's not our prayers that suddenly turn on a spigot. It's like God is on holiday and somebody starts to pray, and so he says, oh, well, I'll have to put on the omnipresence and sort of pass it down. It's not like up to us. It's the nature of creation is such at Ananda. It's always the same. And the question is whether or not what we're attuned to. When we're attuned consistently to our own selfish thoughts and our fears and our sense of ourselves as separate, then we live in a universe of fears and selfish concerns and a sense of separateness. And when we need to do something, we tend to try to do it mostly with our own willpower. If we live in a universe where we understand that just behind everything that we see, the actual vibrating reality of it is divine. I've been reading through, for multiple times I've read it, but I've just been reading from page 1 through Whispers from Eternity, which Stephen was reading from today, these realized prayers. So many of them have phrases like, just behind, help me to see within, help me to see behind, help me to feel thy presence. And he'll describe some aspect of the created world as we experience it. But the prayers help me to look through it into that which is really there. So what level do we vibrate on? Do we vibrate on the level of what we see? Or do we vibrate on the level of what is really there? And the effort on our part that God will reward is the effort to align ourselves with a greater reality. I remember many years ago being caught in a dilemma of some sort, and my temperament being active, I wanted to do something about it. But all reasonable actions were blocked. There was simply nothing I could do. Other people were involved, and there they were. I couldn't force them into actions that they weren't inclined toward. Plus, I just really wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. So I realized that all the energy that I wanted to use, making some practical answer to the problem, it took all of that energy and more instead to hold myself internally in calm, relative peace, to allow whatever it was that was trying to happen around me. And it took far more effort to do nothing than it really would have taken to have done anything, any of the other options that ran through my mind. Now that nothing was not the paralysis of fear. That nothing was to come into stillness, which to hold the mind from panicking, to hold the physical body from all of the things it's going to do, just to stand there and be in alignment, so therefore one's own vibration is not blocking. So Master's mother hears her child, and like any mother, she loves this child, and he has all the indications of an inevitably fatal disease. So this is what it looks like, an inevitably fatal disease. Asiatic cholera, no one recovers. A little skinny 8-year-old boy, her child lying on the bed. That's what it looks like. But over his bed is this photograph of Lahiri Mahashaya, and about whom Master had said, if you consider it a protection, it will be. Otherwise, it's just a photograph. That was how he described it. So she's looking at this. What do I consider this to be? And in the reading today, Swami quotes another incident with another saint who was healed by God's presence. Where my light is, no darkness can dwell. Now, these are such beautiful words that we work so hard to understand. But what we're talking about is the capacity actually to know. This is what we're all working toward. We're all working toward shifting from merely understanding to actual knowing. And you can't make that shift at the moment that your son is dying. His mother did not suddenly see that photograph as a protection at that point. But every day since she had become a disciple, she was turning her attention toward her guru and living her whole life in his vibration. So now in this moment of intense need, everything in her was able to go to that point, look to his photograph. And then all of a sudden, what appeared to be one thing, which is physical death, suddenly became what it really was, which is this overwhelming presence of light. And in that light, no darkness can dwell. Now, this is our progress on the spiritual path, which is why the more advanced souls become, the simpler their thinking gets. Swamiji said that Rajasi, Master's most advanced male disciple, had very little conversation, and when he did speak, he mostly said, Om Guru. He was a brilliant man on every level that brilliance is normally measured. But the more he began to understand what was really happening, the more everything seemed to be summarized. And everything that needed to be said was said. Bow in reverence at the sight of the holy ones and help yourself by aligning yourself with that energy. And then everything else will follow. In the Gita verse, close to this one that's quoted today, there's this verse that says, the all-wise, infinite one cares not at all about our sins and virtues. It was a very interesting phrase, and there's a long story that could go with that too, but just that little piece of it, I've heard so many times how that's been said, that we are nothing but the light, and all of these oscillations of the waves don't really matter, that we discover ourselves to be I was hearing Swami say, when we are finally liberated, we realize that it was just the divine light acting through us, that the ego had never acted at all, it was only God. I was thinking, what glorious phrases, and what it must be like to actually live in that kind of freedom. So this is where we come up with images that help us. Even the idea of Divine Mother is really just an image that helps us help ourselves by putting ourselves in tune. And I was thinking of how I was at the swimming, where I swim at the Y the other day, and they have children's classes, and a mother had come with her child. The child was probably about 3. And it was clear it was the mother's idea that the child would learn to swim, and the child was really not interested. So even though she was all decked out in her swimming costume, she really was not going near the pool. And she was curled up in her mother's lap, as children will be. And by the time I left, she wasn't in the water, but she at least had moved off of her mother's lap and was now sitting next to her on the bench, and they were both contemplating the pool. But I thought how Master talks about taking refuge on the lap of Divine Mother. And so here's this little child faced with something she really doesn't want to do. She takes refuge on the lap of Divine Mother. And I thought about all of our incarnations. And this picture came to my mind of we sort of curl up there for a while, and then she says to us, well, honey, you really do have to get in the swimming pool. Okay, I'll get in the swimming pool. And so we rush out and we throw ourselves in the pool and we splash around and we bash into the other children and we throw things and we break things and all of this stuff happens. Then we're done and we just crawl back like this. Then we wait there for a little while. Then she sends us out again. And all of those experiences, which seem so big to us, are just an interlude between our taking refuge. And the divine doesn't care about our sins and virtues. It doesn't really care what happens. All it cares is that in the end we come back. And until we're finished, till we're completely done, and then we never leave again. Where there is light, no darkness can dwell. Let us help ourselves to be in that light by holding always to that everlasting thought.